Previously, on the 15 decisive battles of the world, the Athenians preserved Greek culture when they defeat the Persians at the Battle of Marathon in 490 BC. Over the 5th century BC, Athens grows in power and threatens to strangle the other blossoming Mediterranean cultures. Their expansion is checked in 413 BC at the Battle of Syracuse by other Greek states. Even those polities could not last, however, as a new Greek state from the north conquers the peninsula and even more. Alexander the Great spreads Greek culture throughout the Near East, securing his legacy at the Battle of Gaugamela against the Persians in 331 BC. Over a century later, the Greeks would lose their power in the Mediterranean, and the struggle for the region would move west. At the Battle of the Medirus River in 207 BC, Rome would strike a crushing blow to the invading Carthaginians and cement itself as the new power. Now, in the year 9 AD, Rome has become an unstoppable empire expanding across the entire Mediterranean coast, and yet this video is not in Latin. And that's thanks to the next battle on this list, where Rome faced off against the Germans to decide the shaping character of the Western culture we know today. So in this video, we're going to be taking a look at the Battle of Teutoburg Forest in 9 AD, which Sir Edward Sheapard Creasy describes as the 5th decisive battle of the world. If you're new to this series, Creasy wrote a book in 1851 outlining what he believed to be the most important battles in world history, and I've been covering these battles one by one. In this video, we'll be looking at the lead up to the battle in the wider context of the world at this point, as well as key figures, weapons and armor, tactics, the battle itself, and the impact the battle had on world history. If you enjoy videos like this, remember to like, comment, subscribe, hit the notification bell for more content, and with that, let's get into the video. So, how did Rome rise from its defense of Italy to Europe's greatest empire? After 207 BC and the defeat of Hannibal in the Second Punic War, Rome would have conflict with Macedonia and later Carthage in the Third and Fourth Macedonian Wars and the Third Punic War, respectively. By 146 BC, Rome had expanded to control Greece and the Adriatic-Baltic coast, lands all the way to the Alps, and most of southern Hispania and Carthage. For the next few decades, Rome would continue to expand, conquering coastal Anatolia and fighting bloody wars with the Numantians and Viriathus in Hispania to conquer most of the region. By 80 BC, Rome would expand to encompass Egypt as well as much of North Africa, although a threat from the east, Mithridates, brought the Romans against another powerful opponent. Still, by 63 BC, Mithridates was defeated, along with much of Anatolia and Armenia, and the next decade would bring Vercingetorix and the Gauls under the Roman yoke, courtesy of Julius Caesar. The Roman civil war would halt, and in some places even reverse expansion of the Republic, before Augustus Caesar would become the first emperor of Rome in 27 BC. Under the reign of Augustus, Rome would continue to expand. North Africa was consolidated, turning the entire Mediterranean coast into a Roman territory, and a beachhead had been established in Britain. Notably for us, however, Augustus expanded into Central Europe, conquering north to the Danube River, and later eastward past the Rhine. As Creasy says, quote, "Roman armies advanced their eagles as far as the Elbe, which now seemed added to the list of vassal rivers to the Nile, the Rhine, the Rhone, the Danube, the Tagus, the Seine, and many more that acknowledged the supremacy of the Tiber." It is here that our story starts. Germanic peoples occupied parts of Scandinavia and Central Europe west of the Rhine and north of the Danube in what is modern Denmark, Germany, Austria, Czechia, and Poland, although they did exist in other areas to the south and west as well. These peoples are thought to have migrated from the north and occupied mainland Europe by around 750 BC. The Germans, even at the time of our story, were a largely illiterate culture with the beginnings of a runic alphabet, mostly for religious purposes, only starting to be developed within 100 years of the birth of Christ. Their religion was a precursor to the Norse religions that would become famous centuries later, and like the Vikings, Germans were a warlike group. The Germans, however, were not politically centralized. Much like the Holy Roman Empire that would occupy the region centuries later, Germans belonged to a variety of different tribes, which were generally located in villages, usually only having 100 or so people, over a large area, with kings as heads of the various tribes. These kings had to deal with their councils and nobles in making decisions, as well as the sibs, or families that made up the tribes. Even their language wasn't standard, and the Germans seem to have lived on a language continuum, where the language would be slightly different by region. Areas close to each other would have mutually intelligible languages, but farther away the differences increased. It was under Augustus that Rome exploited this disunity. Some tribes would ally with the Romans to win over their rivals, while some would try to resist. This lack of a unified front allowed for the Romans to invade North Germania and conquer from the Rhine to the Elbe. Crossing the Rhine in 13 BC, the Roman military pushed eastward for 18 years, pressing local tribes into alliances or subservience one by one. In 5 AD, the Romans fully demonstrated their power by bringing a fleet down the Elbe River inland to meet with the Roman army. The pacified tribes would provide soldiers to Rome, and chieftains would give up their sons to this honor. In German history, 3 of these sons stood out: Maroboduus, Flavus, and Arminius, the later of which we will get into in a minute. The land between the Elbe and the Rhine would not prove easy for Rome to control, and Maroboduus, leader of the Marcomanni tribe, mounted the most prevalent resistance for some time. Having lived in Rome growing up, since his father had given him as a peace offering, Maroboduus returned home in 9 BC. His loyalty returned to the Marcomanni, however, and to escape Roman expansion in the area, he moved the tribe south to the Danube. Plans were in order to venture out and destroy the Marcomanni in 6 AD, but this would never come. This was because of the outbreak of the Illyrian Revolt, where food shortages and abuse by Roman governors precipitated armed rebellion from the locals of what is now Bosnia. The Roman general in charge of Germany, Tiberius, yes, the Tiberius that would later become emperor and Augustus's adopted son, with his skill and command was sent to fight in the revolt. Consequently, he would be replaced by Publius Quinctilius Varus in 7 AD. Prior to this, Varus had been the governor of Roman Syria, where he gained a reputation for crucifixion and brutal suppression of dissent. With the Illyrian Revolt, Varus would only have 3 legions at his disposal. While this was a reduced number from normal, Varus would have the aid of a powerful Romanized chieftain at his side, Arminius. Arminius, along with his brother Flavus, were taken to Rome at a young age and raised in Roman military service. Arminius excelled and moved through the ranks of Roman society, becoming a Roman citizen, and later an eques, which was a step below senator and is equivalent to the title of knight in later European societies. At the end of his 5-year stint in the military service in 6 AD, Arminius returned home and was made the chief of his native tribe, the Cherusci. Working under Varus, Arminius would help to maintain peace in Germania, bolstering Roman military presence and playing a role in bridging the gap in governance styles. It is around this time that Arminius began to change. His exact motives as well as order of events is uncertain, but we know that at least 2 factors were at play. Firstly was the issue of patriotism and standing up for the Germans. How Arminius thought about himself is unknown, and it is possible he had conflicting versions of himself as a proud Roman as well as a Cheruscan leader. The latter identity, however, was probably bolstered in these critical years, partly because he likely spent most of his time around Germans, and partly because of the cruelty of Varus. The governor's brutality did not stay in Syria, but rather brutal reprisals were enacted against the various Germanic tribes as well. This, in conjunction with the institution of tribute and taxation to the Romans, made them a threat where they were once simply tolerated. Arminius' father, Segemeros, may have also played a role, and the duo likely worked together. The other reason that Arminius, I have no idea. The other reason that Arminius began to turn was love. Arminius had fallen in love with a fellow Hurascan, Thusnelda, the daughter of a fellow Hurasci prince, Segestus. Segestus, however, opposed this marriage as he had promised Thusnelda to another man, with Segestus keeping the lovers apart, or maybe it was a one-sided attraction. Again, we don't really know. Tension between the two men were high. How does this involve Rome, you ask? Segestus was a supporter of Rome, an increasingly unpopular stance in Germania. With growing hatred of the Romans, a personal vendetta against one of their allies, and undoubtedly a lust for personal glory and power, Arminius began to devise a plan to liberate his people, become a ruler of men, and unite with the women of his dreams. But to do this, Arminius would have to unite the German peoples, keeping the Romans from hearing about it, train the Germans, defend his land without any fortifications or infrastructure, and drive the Romans out of the region. In some sense, the Romans checked off this first box for him. With Germania recently becoming a province, taxation by the Romans had challenged the tribes economically, while Roman court challenged the legal and social norms of the Germans. While the Germans didn't have a codified law system, conceptions such as exile and blood feuds, as well as localized governance, stood in contrast to Roman laws of execution and imperial rule. The cruelty of Varus, who often crucified his victims, didn't help matters either. In order to keep the Romans in the dark to this disdain, however, Arminius and his allies would humor Varus, participating in court life and acknowledging his superiority, stroking the governor's ego and convincing him of their pacification. In the autumn of 9 AD, Varus and his legions were at their summer camp deep in Germania, probably around Minden along the Weser River. While most of the Roman army was stationed there, detachments were also scattered throughout Germania at the request of the Germans to help infrastructure development and defense against rivals. The Germans were united in secret against the Romans, with Arminius to help them. It was at this time that Arminius set his trap. The Romans were soon to march west back over the river Rhine, where they would winter in familiar territory, no longer needed for defense during the coming cold months that made war and uprisings impossible. Before the Romans left, a revolt of Germans erupted, possibly among the Hausi people to the north. This, however, was only a setup for Arminius' plan, and it's unclear if this revolt even happened or if it was just a ruse. Nonetheless, Varus was ready to stamp out the rebellion, in accordance with Roman policy of violently ending any uprising in its infancy. Varus began to call back his scattered forces when tragedy struck Arminius' plan. Segestus had come to Varus and informed him of Arminius' treachery and the concerted effort to ambush the Romans and kill them. For whatever reason, however, Varus did not listen. Perhaps it was Arminius' credentials as well as perceived loyalty. Perhaps it was total disbelief that the Germans could seriously pose a threat or organize against the Romans. Whatever the case, in September of the year 9, Varus, Arminius, and the Roman legions and camps set off to quell the rebellion, perhaps planning on taking an unfamiliar route west before moving north up the Hunt. This route was of course to Arminius' design, who wanted to disadvantage the Romans as much as possible. The Roman army that marched through Germania was a formidable force, both on the individual and group levels. The army had changed significantly since the Battle of Metaurus River 200 years before, in large part due to a development known as the Marian Reforms. These reforms, brought about by a senator named Marius, surprise, surprise, changed everything from organization, formation, and logistics of the Roman army, and were mostly big picture changes. One of the most important of these was the increased permanence and centralization of the military. Instead of disbanding after every campaign, Roman soldiers would enlist for 16 years, although by the time of Teutoburg it rose to 20 years. This of course created a standing army and allowed Roman soldiers to be very experienced compared to their foes. Unlike prior generations, men without land could join, and the country would pay for the soldiers' gear, greatly increasing the number of people who could join, and promising a disenfranchised class of men with a real future, complete with pay, loot, and pension. Logistically, the Marian reforms changed the transport of supplies and gear when armies were in the field. Rather than a long, unwieldy baggage train, the Roman soldiers had to carry their own gear. This shortened the baggage train while also conditioning Roman troops. This may not have happened at Teutoburg, however, because they thought they were in friendly territory. Perhaps the most interesting change of the Marian reforms was the change from the manipular system to the cohort formations. I covered the manipular system in my previous video looking at Meteorus, but the basic concept allowed for flexibility in vertical movement, where ranks could quickly move forward and backward to prevent fatigue. Smaller quincunx units were able to close ranks or separate to maneuver quickly on the battlefield or form a solid front. This, however, was totally thrown out in favor of the cohort. The basic idea of a cohort is that it was a larger, more tightly packed formation. This allowed for multiple advantages. For one, it raised the morale of soldiers who were very physically close to their comrades, which made them feel safer as opposed to the maniple system, where the soldiers were spaced out about a meter apart from each other. The tighter packing also allowed for more troops on the field, which complemented the general Roman fighting style of close-quarter short sword and shield combat. This concept was exceptionally effective against other European warriors, including Germans, as these soldiers often relied on long swords, which required more space to use effectively, and thus could be outnumbered by the Romans. When the Romans weren't fighting, they would set up nightly base camps for travel. These camps had 4 entrances, which led to paths making a cross formation. Around the camp, a ditch about 3 feet deep was dug, right next to an inner rampart about 5 feet tall and topped with spikes. The entrances had their own blockades to slow any attackers, and the tents inside the fortifications were far enough away that the soldiers inside would be safe from most missile attacks, while also giving them space to get into formation while still in a protected environment. This camp layout, along with other unit changes, was brought about by the Augustinian reforms around the birth of Christ. The unit system of the Roman army changed here as well. The Contubernium was the smallest unit in the Roman army, and even within this, men would pair off and operate on a buddy system, always accompanying each other in their duties and informing the other's family in the event of their death. The Contubernium was made up of 10 men, although only 8 of them were actually soldiers, with the others being servants or engineers. 10 Contubernium made up a century of 80 combatants, plus a commander of watch, 3 standard bearers, the optio second in command, and the leader, the centurion. The centurion would be on the front lines of the century in battle, while the optio would manage the back to ensure good formation and dissuade anyone trying to flee. 6 of these 106-man sentries made up a cohort, with the 6 centurion leaders being commanded by the senior-most of those 6. 10 of these cohorts made up the bulk of the legion. The first cohort in every legion, however, was at double strength, and 120 cavalry equites rounded out the legion for a total of 7,080 men, 5,280 legionaries, 120 equites, 60 sentries, watch commanders, optios, 180 standard bearers, and 1,320 non-combatants. 8 men oversaw each of these legions: camp prefect, 5 eques class men, one of which may have been Arminius, and the 2 head leaders, a future senator and current senator of Rome, the legatus. This was an innovation of the Augustinian reforms, as previously Roman soldiers were loyal to their generals over the state. With a civilian-run military, the army was kept under tight control of the Senate and the emperor. Thus, Each legion actually had 7,088 men total, but only 5,585 were armed in fighting. It's complicated, I know, but this allows us to calculate exact numbers of Roman forces, which is very helpful. And yes, this took a very long time to research. On top of that, there were also auxiliary troops. Legions were made up entirely of Roman citizens, but auxiliary troops from across the empire also fought in battle alongside them. There are different organization structures depending on the type of soldier, but for Teutoburg we only need to look at two: the auxiliary cohort and the allee. The auxiliary cohort is organized in the exact same way as the legionaries, except that the optios and watch commanders aren't present. As you can probably tell by the name, auxiliary cohorts only go up to the cohort level, and there is no legion for auxiliaries, although double cohorts did exist. A prefect led the whole cohort. In total, an auxiliary cohort had 625 men and 487 fighters. Like the legions, standard bearers did not fight and were not armed, although they were on the battlefield. The other unit, the allee, was a cavalry group consisting of 512 riders plus one prefect. It is possible that Arminius was the prefect at the head of one of these allee, although the fact that he was a citizen by this point may complicate things, and they never list explicitly what he was at the time. That being said, the men he led were local Germans, so it was likely an allee instead of a legion of cavalry. In the field of battle, cohorts would fight together, cavalry would reside on the flanks, although their use was not as important to the Roman military as in other armies. To start a battle, Romans would employ ranged weaponry. Auxiliary forces such as archers or slingers would start, and then legionaries would throw their pilum spears as the distance closed. Once the armies did close, the legionaries would fight in a tight formation using sword and shield. The legionaries would often attack the opponent diagonal from them, as they would be busy fighting the legionary in front. The Germans, meanwhile, didn't have a nearly as well-defined structure. Most of what we know comes from Roman sources, who often portrayed Germans as uncivilized, unsophisticated fighters. Some of this is undoubtedly true, as organization was much less centralized, but we have been able to piece together some important, albeit vague, details of the Germanic war machine. Germans were a warlike people, and most men in the region had been taught to fight, although this was mostly on the individual level. While some level of group tactics existed, they were applied inconsistently, and not all tribes were equally sophisticated in this regard. The Chatti and Marcomanni tribes, for example, are described as emulating Roman components of drilling and discipline, with soldiers learning to fight in larger units and develop discipline that wouldn't quickly break down in battle. Germans primarily relied on pitched battles, where a tribe would try to conclude a military engagement in one fell swoop, as the warriors had to tend to their affairs at home and thus couldn't be mobilized for long periods of time. The warriors were generally raised by kings or clan leaders who led a retinue or a small dedicated warrior posse, along with whichever other men answered the call. Military endeavors, again, were not heavily structured or commanded, and thus success in battle largely hinged on the leader's ability to be popular and convince many warriors to join his band. While on the battlefield, Germans would often employ an intimidation tactic known as the Baritus, where soldiers would hold their shield up to their mouth and make a low, roaring sound that would echo and reverberate. If this scared the enemy off, then the battle was over. But if not, the Germans would advance with two main types of formations. One was a classic shield wall, which was compared to the Macedonians by Roman forces. The whole line would move forward, shields close to each other and spears at the ready. The other mode of advance was the wedge, where a leader and his personal retinue would advance at the head of a triangular formation. In this way, the Germans could concentrate their force on one area and break through, although the stakes were high if this didn't work, as reinforcement lines were not used until later by the Germans. German cavalry was considered superior to their Roman equivalents, and they would often be accompanied by a group of mobile, trained infantry to protect and serve alongside them, known as the Hundred. Kings and other warriors of status are often thought to have been mounted as well. Once closing with the enemy, the Germans would pit their weapons and armor against each other, just like people do in every single battle, ever. The bread and butter of the Germanic armament was the spear and shield, although like the wider German war efforts, these were not standardized by any means. Defensively, shields took many shapes. Circular, oblong, and hexagonal shields were all used and were generally of medium size, sometimes adorned with bright colors and designs. An iron boss was common on most shields, however, and some were even pointed. Past the shield, armor was rare for Germans, although the more well-off among them would adorn themselves with what they could. The layman would only have the clothes on his back for protection, while richer Germans would use chainmail tunics and occasionally scale armor. We also know that some tribes painted their faces or bodies in specific ways. The Chatti, for example, were known to paint their whole bodies black. Helmets varied and were usually Roman, either antiquated or newly acquired forms, such as the Montefortino or imperial styles made of bronze or iron. In terms of the spear, there may have been two variants. One, often referred to as a lance, would have been longer and probably used by horsemen. The other, called a framea, would have been shorter, perhaps 5 to 7 feet in length, and would be used for both handheld thrusting as well as throwing. Germans may have carried multiple framea, and as Tacitus wrote of them, quote, "The foot soldiers also scatter showers of missiles, each man having several and hurling them at an immense distance." Swords were used by Germans as well, although like armor, they were rare and generally reserved for the elite. German swords were generally longer, although two main blade types are common. One is a single-edged style and may have been of medium or even long length, say around 30 inches, and was the predecessor to the sax knife that we see commonly in later Germanic and Viking eras. The other was a long 30 to 36-inch double-edged sword. Germanic metalsmithing was not too advanced around this time, and natively made swords likely were not of high-quality iron. But like armor, the best swords came from Rome. The Roman spatha, a longer version of the gladius, also around 30 to 36 inches long, made for cavalry, was a favorite among the Germanic elite and was the primary double-edged sword used at the time. German cavalry, while disproportionately richer and better equipped than infantry, would have all of this gear at their disposal, mostly relying on a lance or framea throwing spears. German riders rode bareback and employed spurs to control their horses. Roman cavalry, on the other hand, were often not actually Roman. While legions were equipped with small cavalry detachments, most horsemen were actually from other parts of the empire, especially Gaul and Germany. Unsurprisingly, this meant that Roman and German cavalry were armed similarly. An oblong or hexagonal shield protected the rider, while 3 lancia spears, around 6 feet long, would be the primary offensive weapon. These spears could be thrown or thrusted, and likely filled a similar role to the Germanic framea. The spatha rounded out their offensive weaponry, and was employed once lancia had been thrown. These cavalrymen would likely have been resupplied during the battle as well. Roman cavalry also wore saddles in contrast to the Germans, but stirrups did not exist at this time. For armor, both cavalry and infantry units likely wore the Gaelic imperial style of helmet, sporting a nape guard, cheek protection, and a brow ridge, all made of iron. For chest protection, cavalry would often use any of the Roman cuirasses available to them. Lorica segmentata, made of overlapping plates, Lorica squamata, or scale armor, and Lorica hamata, mail shirts, were all used, although scale armor is thought to have been more common in the eastern provinces. Infantry had a similar level of diversity, although Lorica segmentata is often thought to be the most popular chest protection. For higher level commanders, Lorica musculata, A Greek-style solid iron chest plate with cool muscles on it would have been the mark of affluence and provided better protection. Greaves rounded out the Roman armor set. The scutum shield was one of the most valuable pieces of gear for the Romans and had evolved since its use in Metaurus. The shield was still convex, but was rectangular in shape and thought to be a bit smaller, perhaps around 2 to 2.5 feet wide and 3 to 3.5 feet tall. To start battle, legionaries would throw their pilum spears. These odd-shaped weapons had a long, narrow iron head with a barbed tip, meant to dig into enemy shields and render them useless. Perhaps due to the Marian reforms, one of the fixtures to the head of the shaft was made into a less sturdy wooden peg, which would further deform the weapon after use and make it even more awkward to remove. Legionaries at this time carried 2 pila. Once the distance had closed, the Romans would draw their gladius sword. The gladius had changed a little bit over time, with the version used at Metaurus, gladius hispanicis, being longer. By this time, however, 2 main types of gladius were in play, the mains and fulum types. These, of course, are named after places or people that discovered them more so than some historical name for them. The mains in fulum had a less gradual taper at the tip, and the main difference between the two is that the mains was wasp-waisted and grew thinner in the middle of the blade before widening again before the tip. Both blades were around 20 inches in length, a full 5 inches shorter than the hispanicis. A leaf-shaped dagger around 8 inches long, known as the pugio, may also have been used as a last resort weapon. Roman auxiliary troops and allied divisions were armed in a similar manner, although they likely had worse equipment than their counterparts. In terms of metallurgy, the Romans had largely moved to using iron and iron alloys in their weapons and armor. The Germans had mostly moved to iron as well, although native gear was generally of poorer quality, and bronze was still used mostly in helmets. For force sizes, we know that the Romans likely had the advantage, and we have better estimates. Varus had 3 legions numbered 17, 18, and 19, as well as 6 auxiliary cohorts and 3 alay cavalry squadrons, although Arminius probably led one of these, and thus that one would count for the Germans. Knowing what we know about Roman force sizes, we can say that Varus had approximately 19,000 infantry and 1,400 cavalry at his disposal. It is also worth noting that these legions, given the low intensity in Germania, were inexperienced. We have no solid numbers for the Germans, but we can say that they at least had a 513 alay cavalry, including Arminius. It is generally believed that the Germans were outnumbered in battle, and the numbers changed over its course, probably fluctuating between 10 and 15,000 infantry. Cavalry is a harder number to gauge, but it probably would have been smaller given the nature of the battle and Arminius' support, perhaps another 500 or so for a total of about 1,000. We also don't know all of the tribes that joined in this attack. Only the Haraski, the Marsi, and the Bructeri are confirmed, and perhaps the Hausi, since they were in possession of a Roman standard decades after the battle. We can assume, however, that other tribes, especially around the area of the fight, did engage as well. The battle actually took place over a large area and was not a pitched battle in the traditional sense. Instead, the battle is thought to have taken place over an expansive area about 60 miles long in what is now Western Germany around Lower Saxony and Westphalia. The area historically was a mix of forests, swamps, mountains, and rivers, as well as open land cultivated and inhabited by the Germans. Historical accounts, namely Cassius Dio, describe the area as heavily forested and uneven. Quote, "The mountains had an uneven surface broken by ravines, and the trees grew close together and very high." But it is thought that this could be inaccurate for 2 reasons. One is that the tropes of a forested, untamed wilderness were very common when describing lands thought of as the edges of the world, and this trope was common with writers and historians at this time. Secondly, we know through archaeology that this area, while not densely populated, had large swaths of cleared farmland and settlement. In all likelihood, the geographic descriptions are exaggerated, but the weather and topography described actually affect the story instead of serving just as a backdrop, so my guess is that it is likely born in truth. The exact area that this battle took place over is also disputed, although there is at least one site confirmed archaeologically to have been involved, and I am mostly going off of the description of the battle told by the Livius website, link in the description, but I give more credence to the historic accounts of difficult terrain than they do. The rough area we will be looking at is in northwestern Germany, west of the Weser River and east of the Ems, along the southern ends of the Haas and Hund rivers. The area is mostly flat and is located on the North European plain, although it was likely more forested historically than it is now. The southern part of this theater includes forested hill ranges. The two main areas on this 60-mile path that we'll be looking at for the battle are the Kalkreis Narrows and the Teutoburg Forest, although the battle doesn't end or necessarily even begin in either of these places. The first is the Kalkreis Narrows, located in the modern town of the same name. This area is a few miles long stretch of land that an ancient road likely passed through. To the north lay a swamp, and to the south lay a wooded hill about 500 feet in prominence. At the time of the battle, the clear strip of land was thought to be between 10 and 250 yards across, and possibly sandy. Along the base of the hill, the Germans had made a camouflaged palisade. Zooming out, we see that the Haas River runs east, then bends north about 5 miles west of the Narrows. Moving south, we approach the Teutoburg Forest, which is likely more similar to dramatic historical accounts of the battle. Teutoburg is a heavily wooded, hilly area with some passes running through it. The forest, more accurately forested hills, spans about 100 miles diagonally. Dramatic rock outcroppings, rivers, and lakes make the forest a beautiful area, and hills as high as 1,000 feet in prominence made the area untraversable to armies except through the narrow passes. We don't know any specifics, however, of the area within the Teutoburg Forest that the battle took place in, although it would be a good guess to say that the Romans moved through a pass towards the western end of the range. On top of this, the records describe heavy rainfall throughout parts of the battle. The path, location, or locations of the battle is not something that is fully understood. Sir Edward Sheapard Creasy gives a telling of the battle that seems to be inaccurate given archaeological evidence, for example, and more recent tellings of the story, such as the Netflix series Barbarians and the Kings and Generals video sponsored by that series, tell another tale which seems to have very little basis in history. Even the Wikipedia series of events is different from both of these. Again, the series of events I tell here is mostly based on a well-explained reconstruction from Livius, link in the description, and in a later part of the video I plan on talking about the historiography of this battle and the challenges I encountered while doing this research. After gathering his forces, Varus departed his summer camp, likely located on the Weser River near the modern city of Minden. Moving west, the Romans marched in a lackadaisical fashion. After all, they thought they were in friendly, pacified territory. While there was likely basic order to this line, likely the 1st Legion in front, Varus and his guard next, and then the other 2 legions behind, the Romans were also interspersed with civilians, including slaves, family members, and of course non-combatants that helped to make up the legions and build infrastructure. At some point on this first day of marching, Arminius asked Varus to be excused and take his cavalry forward to scout. Varus obliged, and the Hruskin went off to join his countrymen. At this point, it is unclear what happens exactly for the rest of the day. It is possible that Roman detachments throughout the countryside or Varus's scouts were the first ones to be killed by the Germans, if detachments and scouts were there at all. It is also possible that the Germans began their attack on this day as well. It is most likely, however, that this day was totally peaceful for the Romans. Whatever the case, a large majority, if not all of the force, made it to around the River Hunt, where they set up a secure camp for the night. The second day is when we know for a fact that there was fighting. Moving west, the Romans moved into the Calcrease Narrows. The thin stretch of land, coupled with the fact that the Roman columns were disorganized and about 10 miles in length, were made worse by the torrential downpour, which made moving through the muddy or sandy strip even slower. It was here where the Germans attacked. Quote, "While the Romans were in such difficulties, the barbarians suddenly surrounded them on all sides at once, coming through the densest thickets as they were acquainted with the paths. At first they hurled their volleys from a distance, then, as no one defended himself and many were wounded, they approached closer to them. For the Romans were not proceeding in any regular order, but were mixed in helter-skelter with the wagons and the unarmed, and so, being unable to form readily anywhere in a body, and being fewer at every point than their assailants, they suffered greatly and could offer no resistance at all." Situated on the Calcrease Hill and behind their fortification, the Germans began to throw their Formia spears at the Romans. Communication was impossible, and given the scattering of Roman remains archaeologically, it is likely that the formation began to splinter, with some going north and others staying south once out of the Narrows. It is possible that German cavalry excelled in this part of the battle, as the Romans were in open field and still disorganized. The Romans, ever the disciplined fighters, made an attempt to take the German fortification, but failed and were pushed back. German auxiliary troops, once loyal to Rome, may have abandoned the legionaries and joined the Germans in their assault. Many Romans died here, but they seem to have survived this initial attack and made the decision to abandon the alleged revolt, opting to move southwest towards the Lippe River, where a string of Roman forts were located. The Germans harried the Romans until nightfall, surrounding them on all sides, when what remained of the legions made a hasty camp on a hilltop not far from the massacre, likely in the Weinhengeberg Hills. This night, the Romans knew what they were in for, and in an attempt to speed along their retreat, burned their wagons. Varus continued in battle formation the next day, likely hooking south, taking more casualties before entering plains west of the modern city of Osnabrück. Looming in their path, however, was the Teutoburg forest. One can try to imagine the mindset of the Romans at this point. Friends, and maybe even family, had been killed. The Germans, while brave, were militarily inferior, yet they had surprised them and delivered a blow that the Romans had rarely ever seen. The weather and woods made it hard to walk, much less fight, and the key to Roman military supremacy, high concentrations of men in every spot, had been totally reversed. And yet, the survivors made it through and into relative safety. The Germans didn't dare attack the Romans in open ground, but they wouldn't have to. For a few miles ahead, gloomy forests, more imposing and grand than the last, lay ahead, unavoidable and signifying certain death. Surely some Romans pled with the leadership to take a longer way around the wooded hills, even if it was much longer. Blisters and hunger are better than impalement, after all. And yet there was nothing that could be done. The condemned continued into the Teutoburg forest, where the slaughter resumed. Arminius, with his knowledge of Roman fight, was able to completely mitigate the strengths of the legions. Communication and formation were totally destroyed, as the narrow paths made it impossible for cohorts to form up and maneuver effectively. Further, the Germans could concentrate on certain parts of the line and break it, possibly like wedge formations, with their numbers and flanking mobility. The Roman losses here were the worst, and the situation was made even worse when the legate of one of the legions, Numenos Valla, rounded up the remaining Roman cavalry and left the infantry behind. Maybe he went to get help, maybe he fled out of cowardice, but the only thing we know for sure is that he, along with all of the Roman cavalry, was killed, likely intercepted by Arminius and his traitorous ally. As the battle went on, more and more German tribes, at first unsure if they should fight the Romans, joined the fight, while more auxiliary forces peeled off from the Roman ranks and joined their countrymen. In an effort to expedite their escape, Varus and what was left of his men likely marched through the night, entering more hospitable territory. They continued southwest and eventually made it closer to the Ems River. The rain and wind, however, picked up, and as Cassius Dio says, "For they could not handle their bows or javelins with any success, nor, for that matter, their shields, which were thoroughly soaked. Their opponents, on the other hand, being for the most part lightly equipped, and able to approach and retire freely, suffered less from the storm. Furthermore, the enemy's forces had greatly increased, as many of those who had at first wavered joined them, largely in the hope of plunder, and thus they could more easily encircle and strike down the Romans, whose ranks were now thinned, many having perished in the earlier fighting. The river valley was swampy, constraining Roman movement to even narrower roads, and it is in this area, likely north of the river, that Varus is wounded and the Romans made their last stand. Eventually, Varus, along with many other officers, committed suicide. The remaining Roman forces either surrendered or were killed, although some lucky few escaped the carnage and made it to safety. Many of those captured were killed in ritualistic sacrifices by the Germans. Arminius had won the day, and the Germans had decimated the Roman presence in Germania. We have no concrete numbers for German losses, perhaps 2,000 to 4,000, although this is purely a guess. Almost the entire Roman force was destroyed, however, around 20,000 people. Emancipation was all but certain for Germania. Some Romans managed to escape the forts on the Lippe River, and not long after Teutoburg, the Germans started a full-on insurrection. Back in Rome, Emperor Augustus was distraught and feared invasion into Gaul. Still tied up in Illyria, the situation was desperate, and Augustus tried everything he could to levy an army, changing requirements and even executing some who refused to join. Augustus, around this time, is reported to have banged his head on doors in frustration and to have famously exclaimed, "Quintilius Varus, give me back my legions." The Germans did not invade Gaul, but every Roman fort past the Rhine except one was taken over the following months. From this fort, the Romans would go on to counterattack and lead several campaigns over the coming years under Tiberius and Germanicus. For Arminius, this only complicated the issues within Germania. The Germans did not want to unite under Arminius, and infighting broke out between them, most notably with Maroboduus and the Marcomanni in Segestus, who opted to work for the Romans. Arminius was finally able to make off with Thusnelda in 14 AD, but the next year Segestus and the Romans took her hostage while she was pregnant, and Arminius would never see his wife or child again. In 16 AD, Arminius would face off against Germanicus and his Roman forces in the same region as Teutoburg, but this time more familial troubles plagued him. His brother, Flavus, had remained loyal to Rome, and in a famous encounter captured in poetry, the two brothers faced off across a river from each other. Each tried to win the other over to their side before they began to argue. Creasy writes, quote, "It makes us reflect on the desolate position of Arminius, with his wife and child captives in the enemy's hands, and with his brother a renegade in arms against him. The great liberator of our German race stood there, with every source of human happiness denied him, except the consciousness of doing his duty to his country." Arminius would be wounded in the ensuing battle, but ultimately the Romans never seriously threatened Germania after Teutoburg. From then on, it was the policy of Augustus and later Tiberius that expansion past the Rhine was not to be pursued. Arminius' thirst for power, however, did not satiate, and he sought to rule the German people. The freedom-loving tribes, however, resented this, and eventually in 21 AD, in his late 30s, Fellow Horoski tribesmen killed Arminius to prevent him from growing too powerful. For those who don't know, historiography is essentially meta-history. It's the study of how history is recorded, and in historiography we look at everything from the validity of sources to how we can cross-reference different mediums to come to a conclusion. When we look at Teutoburg, there are two main types of sources we have: primary historical accounts and archaeology. There are only 4 Roman accounts of Teutoburg, and they all look at different aspects of it. Most only give it minor attention, but one of the sources, Cassius Dio, who I keep mentioning, actually goes into more detail on the battle. For this reason, we don't really need to delve extremely deep into comparing these authors, since only one has very relevant information. It is worth noting, however, the civilizational level of the recording and the bias there. Only Rome talks of this event, as the Germans were illiterate and did not record anything about the battle. It did, however, pass through time with an oral tradition, although I will admit I don't know if modern German concepts of the battle derive from the rediscovery of Roman accounts, or if they are the long-term continuation of the oral tradition. That being said, the fact that the Romans admitted to their utter defeat gives a lot of credence to the fact that the destruction of the legions actually happened in this way. Oftentimes we will see Greece or Rome claim that they killed a massive amount of the enemy, or that they were heavily outnumbered, but those embellishments serve to make them look good. Teutoburg, no matter what, makes the Romans look bad. And if an account seems to be inconvenient for a group that wrote it, it is very likely to be accurate. This doesn't mean all of the details are accurate, however. We talked earlier about the forest tropes, about the edge of the world as an example, and in some sources, the failure of the battle is scapegoated onto Varus so as to save face of the rest of the Roman military or leadership. Perhaps the most difficult part of all of this to sort out is where this happened and the travel path of the Romans. We can be reasonably sure of most everything else, the men involved, the fact that the Romans were lost, when it happened, and how many days it took, all from primary sources. But sometimes archaeology can cast doubt on the locations or specific nature of the battle. Teutoburg is unique among battle sites in that there has actually been archaeological discovery of the battle, so it makes locations much more concrete. For Teutoburg, the Calcrease Narrows are the site the battle has been attached to, and the spread of the finds show us a massive slaughter of Romans took place around this area. We also know that civilians were involved, as jewelry and women's possessions were found in this area as well. But the issue we have here isn't with the archaeology itself, but some modern retellings of Teutoburg only look at this site and use it as evidence to jettison most of the original material or the local German legends that the battle took place in the Teutoburg forest, further south of Calcrease. The Wikipedia article, for example, even says that the Teutoburg area is mistakenly associated with the battle. In the Kings and Generals video, the battle is made to seem as if it happened all in one day. Both of these sources, however, seem to overlook the fact that the battle took place over multiple days, i.e., Calcrease is probably not the only place that the battle transpired, and there was likely some fighting in Teutoburg as well, and this may have even been where the army was destroyed fully. Again, we don't fully know. Again, in my research, I thought the Livius reconstruction of the battle was the most accurate, as it actually combined the archaeology and the source material. Even Creasy doesn't seem to have an idea of what's going on, at least, compared to what I believe, and while he does acknowledge the multiple days, he seems to picture Varus moving eastward, coming from the Rhine, and moving to intercept the rebellion. That's it for my little rant on this, but in my research it was just very interesting to see how every source had a totally different interpretation of what happened. And again, the Livius source combined primary sources and archaeology in the best way, and also was the most consistent with Cassius's account. Creasy makes an interesting case as to why the battle is among the most decisive in the world. We must first remember that Creasy wrote this in 1851 and was of course very Eurocentric and even Anglocentric within that. Thus, when Creasy looks at decisive battles, they are decisive to the history of Western culture and even more specifically English culture. The English language, of course, is primarily Germanic, and Germanic peoples, namely the Saxons, came to England during the migration period. Thus, it stands to reason that the preservation of German language and culture would directly impact the English world. Creasy goes even further, though, and claims that Arminius is actually more so a progenitor to England than to Germany. Quote, "The mainstream of our people was and is Germanic. Our language alone proves this. Arminius is far more truly one of our national heroes than Caractacus. His reasoning here is that the Hruski people are actually more closely related to the Saxons, which went to England, than to modern Germanic groups." Once again, we see Creasy made assumptions that would have been common for his time, namely tying ethnicity to culture, and we even have a very noteworthy description of the Syrians, which is expected for that time, I suppose. Being descended from Arminius does not make people great. Culture can certainly differentiate between societies, and values and traditions can be preserved and passed down to make a society great, and that can obviously overlap to some degree with ethnicity, but the ethnicity of the people in the society is irrelevant. The ideas are what count. I go into more detail about this in the previous 15 battles video, and to some degree even in my Ukraine video, so feel free to check those out. Creasy has the beginnings of a good point. Modern English and German cultures have borne great traditions and ideas, and bad ones too, but you get my point. These traditions were distinct from Roman influences and developed independently. Thus, Teutoburg greatly shaped European history by preserving English and German cultures and ensuring Roman society didn't fully homogenize Europe. This idea actually mirrors the impact of the Battle of Syracuse, so feel free to look into that video as well. But let's interrogate this idea further and try to answer 3 questions. 1. Did Teutoburg decisively save Germania? 2. Would Rome have taken the region and destroyed or changed its culture otherwise? And 3. What did English and German societies do to shape the world we live in today? Starting with the first question, did Teutoburg decisively save Germania? The answer is probably yes. Teutoburg, or at least a battle like Teutoburg, was probably necessary to fully excise Rome from the region. Teutoburg was not just a battle that the Germans won, but a battle that unified the Germans and, more importantly, destroyed the Roman legions and demoralized the emperor himself. It's not obvious how replicable a result like this could be. Again, the Germans certainly would have fought the Romans, but the result would probably have been German subjugation, and we can use Gaul as our template. Yes, Gaul was conquered because Julius Caesar was an incredible general, and such a general didn't exist at this time to replicate the result in Germania. That being said, Germania was much less populated than Gaul, and its militaries were much smaller and less effective. Besides, even if Caesar couldn't conquer Gaul on his own, it likely would have just been done over a longer period. The only hope the Gauls had of independence, which nearly came to fruition on a couple occasions, was a decisive, utter defeat of the Romans that killed the general and all of the troops, crippling Rome's military capacity. As it turns out, that's what happened in Germania with Teutoburg. So yes, it is likely that Rome would have taken Germania had Teutoburg not happened. Next is the hardest question to answer, at least for me. Would Roman expansion into Germania have destroyed Germanic culture? That's much harder for me to say. Instead, I defer to looking at the wider empire of Rome. If we look at this map, we can cross-reference how certain areas developed over time. The Spaniards, French, and English all would go on to form powerful states. The Asian and African empires would be conquered by the Arabs and later Turkic groups, who had their own path of development. And if we look at Germany, it did not have a powerful centralized government until the 1800s and also was never taken over by Rome. Can we say then that areas conquered by Rome would go on to develop better over time, or at least more centralized? due to cultural, political, and material changes brought by the Romans? Well, no, we can't say that. Case in point, Italy itself. Italy underwent the same issues Germany had, and it never was really unified before the 1800s, and it was actually weaker than Germany since it was consistently carved up by neighboring states. The Balkans and Greece were also conquered for a long time by Rome, but no centralized states emerged there until the 1800s either. Then again, they were also conquered by the Ottomans, so that could be a big reason why as well. So in short, it's difficult to say, at least given what I know about Roman long-term influences on the areas that they conquered. That being said, they did seem to level most areas that they took. How much has Celtic or Carthaginian or Iberian or even Egyptian culture influenced the world? Not really that much, and it's hard to say with Egypt, but when you think about it, literally most of the stuff was like super cool, but it didn't really go outside of Egypt. Only Greece seems to have kept its pre-Roman culture unscathed, and that's probably because the Romans took so much inspiration from them. The areas that did rise to prominence in these areas either were heavily affected by Rome, i.e. Western Europe, or were conquered by other great empires, say for the Ottomans, but the Ottomans were descended from a Turkic group that came in earlier, so they weren't there originally. None really retained an organic revitalization of their native culture, so I'd say Roman conquest of Germania most likely would have severely altered, if not ended, Germanic culture. What would have been lost if Rome won at Teutoburg? This of course leads into a broader question of the foundations of Western civilization, and there are multiple interpretations of this. There are more conventional understandings which see the West primarily founded on Judeo-Christian, Greek, and Roman foundations, and others that propose a higher influence of the medieval church and Germanic cultures. I'm not going to try to answer the question of which is right here, but I will be exploring the possible influences Germanic culture had on Western civilization, and I'll give some of my own cursory input on it. Most of these concepts I'm about to talk about are covered in What If Altists video called Understanding Western Civilization, and I'll link that in the description as well. In that video, the case is made that Germanic culture contributed two main things to Western civilization: a warrior culture and individual rights. Now, at various points in history, Rome had some level of both. High-powered individuals, emperors and senators included, learned and served in the military, and military service was a path to citizenry for those in the provinces of the empire. This was the case at the time of Teutoburg and even earlier. While the Republic had collapsed by Teutoburg, Rome still had a history of republicanism and was perhaps the foremost example in history. That being said, both institutions had rotted away by the time of the Roman collapse. The Republic, of course, had pretty much devolved into a kleptocratic oligarchy by the 1st century BC and had become an empire later that century. Wealth inequality also continued to get worse and worse, an issue that had plagued Rome for a very long time. The empire was tyrannical and defunct by the 5th century, and at the same time the leaders became decadent. The formerly proud and martial military tradition of Rome had been largely outsourced, with barbarians filling the military ranks and becoming more popular than the isolated and soft Roman aristocrats. The Germans, on the other hand, did not see a decline in these concepts, and it is likely that their infiltration of the Western Roman Empire is actually what brought these ideas forward into Europe through the Middle Ages. If we look at the barbarian groups that controlled Europe after Rome fell, they were all Germanic: Visigoths, Ostrogoths, Vandals, Saxons, Burgundians, and Franks. Earlier we talked about the decentralized, relatively democratic norms of German society, and these norms are likely what carried forward into giving Europe a strong nobility through the Middle Ages, preventing the continent from becoming a totalitarian region. Instead, kings had to negotiate with nobles to get what they wanted, and the absolute monarchies we commonly associate with Europe really only started in the 17th century. That being said, the average person was still pretty oppressed. But anyway, even then, the areas with a more historic Germanic settlement, England and Germany, didn't experience this, and instead the absolute monarchies were found in areas like France, Spain, and Russia, which have far less, if any, German settlement. The warrior culture is also important for Western society as well, mostly because it prevented a total collapse of Europe in the face of invaders. Other societies, namely China, the Arab world, and the Rus, were at one point or another totally decimated and effectively set back by invasion from abroad, namely the Mongols. Both the Mongols and the Huns attempted to conquer Europe, and both failed, in no small part because of the military culture that defined Western society. This military culture also required constant technological development, since the various nations and nobles were all fighting each other all the time. I would add that this innovation and adaptation by Europe of military tech and tactics also helped Europe conquer other parts of the world later in history. Thus, German influence on the West laid the groundwork for modern democracy, allowed it to weather attacks from the outside that would hamper this, and later helped facilitate its expansion. It's also likely, however, that the concept of popular governments, which blossomed in the Enlightenment, was partly inspired by the reintegration of classical ideas. The Roman contribution, however, was mostly institutional rather than philosophical, and gave more influence in regards to how to set up a republic instead of the justification to establish one. Those are just my thoughts though, so in short, I think it's totally viable that Germanic influences brought about more democratic norms in the West and kept it safe and sharp against invaders. And most solid evidence for this is that the Germanic countries avoided despotism in the 17th and 18th centuries, and England in particular was the home of our most modern traditions of democracy, even if they were expanded upon and perfected in America, which actually has a very large German population. Oh, coincidence. So if we had to imagine a world without Teutoburg, what would that be like? It's likely that the Middle Ages would have been quite different and centralized states would have been more common down the line. This would probably mean that democracy would develop in a different way in Europe and would closely emulate Roman ideas when it came back to the Enlightenment. These democracies in the West would probably be less successful and less democratic, since the forms of popular government employed wouldn't have been a long-term development, but rather a transplant from the classical era, which would likely pose significant issues down the line. Europe may also have been wiped out by the Huns or Mongols or Arabs at some point, which would effectively reset Western society developmentally like it did with Eastern Europe. All of this, of course, assumes that German influence regarding the warrior culture and democracy was stronger than Roman influences in our current world, and it also assumes that another similar group wouldn't also have these values, and it assumes that Germanic culture wouldn't rise in prominence again once Rome began to decline, all of which can be debated. So, how important was Teutoburg historically, and how does it stack up to other battles on this list? Overall, I think this battle was pretty important and fills a similar role in history as the Battle of Syracuse. Western culture was developed from many cultures, and both battles ensured that those cultures survived in the face of a more dominant Western hegemony. I'd say it's probably the second least important on this list, just because I think the Germanic culture wasn't as foundational as Greece or Rome, but I still think it was more influential than Hellenism, brought about by Gaugamela, as the importance of that development doesn't seem as foundational, at least to me. After Teutoburg, Rome would continue to expand, conquering Mesopotamia, most of the Balkans, and Britain. The empire, however, would start to decline, first dividing in half, and then collapsing in the face of barbarian invasions, mostly from Germanic peoples. By the mid-5th century, Rome was a shadow of its former self, and another threat from the east rolled into the continent. Attila the Hun ravaged Eastern and Central Europe, and threatened to conquer and reshape the West. It was here, at the Battle of Chalons, that the next battle on Creasy's list takes place. So that's it for this video, guys. Hope you enjoyed. Remember to like, comment, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more content. I've been recording this for way too long, so I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.